My uncle has been living in my building for 4 years. He pays his rent on time. He filed one noise complaint, properly filled out, with dates and times, the kind of complaint a person files when they trust that systems work. He is, by every measure I know, a good tenant. He is also the man who sat beside me at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, at my cousin's graduation dinner. And in all of those years, not one of those occasions, did anyone in my family ask the question that would have made any of it visible. The name is on the card, Hartley Properties. My name, my company. No one ever asked enough to get there. My name is Christine, and that changed at my mother's 70th birthday party. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a bit. Tonight we're going to spend some time with Christine, 58 years old, built a real estate company from the ground up over 20 years, drove 40 minutes to her mother's 70th birthday, knowing exactly what had been said about her in that room. Before we start, subscribe. It helps us grow the channel. Let's go. The birthday was on a Saturday in October, at my Aunt Patrice's house, on the street of identical colonials in Dunmore, where the trees are 40 years old and the screen door springs close too fast. I know every detail of that house from before I could read. The loose board on the second porch step, the smell of carpet cleaner that persists regardless of season, the hook near the front door where winter coats hang from October to April without anyone reorganizing them. I spent my childhood in and out of that place. I've spent my adult life doing the same, at longer intervals. The party had been planned by Patrice for 3 months. I knew this because my cousin Linda called in July to say the party was on the 14th, then called in August to say Patrice had moved it to the 21st because of a conflict with the Murphys' anniversary, to which none of us had been invited anyway, and then called in September to confirm it was back to the 14th, because Patrice and the Murphys had resolved something I didn't fully follow. What I understood from all 3 calls was the 14th, Dunmore, 2 o'clock, bring something. I brought white daisies, which my mother likes and Patrice is allergic to. I considered that in the parking lot of the flower shop. Then I bought them anyway. My mother has 7 siblings. 5 have children. Of those children, somewhere between 12 and 15 were expected, depending on who had rescheduled, who had canceled the rescheduling, and who Patrice had decided not to invite after the Murphy situation. I have one cousin I genuinely like, which is Linda, 2 more toward whom I'm neutral, and the rest fall into the category of people I know well enough to have opinions about, but not well enough to voice them. We've been doing this for decades. We know our positions in the room. My uncle Gerald was there, 73 years old, retired from a telecommunications company after 36 years. He has the quality that certain men of a certain generation develop of being genuinely comfortable in whatever room they're placed in, not socially ambitious, not anxious, just present. He sees what's in front of him. He doesn't dress things up differently than they are. I have always liked that about him. My cousin Anita was there, 42, Patrice's oldest, direct without being cruel, accustomed to having the correct version of things. Her husband, Terry, works in insurance and has the specific quality of insurance professionals of being comfortable with numbers and slightly formal until he decides you've earned informality. Anita and Terry had been living in my building in North Dunmore for 3 years. She called the maintenance line twice, once in January 2021 for a heating issue, once in the spring of 2022 for a stuck door handle. Both were handled by my office manager, Renee, and the maintenance crew I use for that building. Neither time did Anita have reason to connect the company name on the letterhead to her cousin Christine. Gerald had been living in my building in South Dunmore for 4 years. I was the one who renewed his lease every January. I was the name in the county records, the owner of the building where he slept every night. I knew that. He didn't. My mother is Lorraine. She is not a cruel person. I need to say that before I say what she'd been doing, because what she'd been doing can sound cruel, and it isn't. She is someone who grew up in a world where what you did for work was either legible or it wasn't, and where illegible work made the people who loved her anxious on your behalf, and she never quite updated that. She worked as a medical secretary for 31 years. She raised 3 children. She keeps the house impeccably clean and has opinions about casserole construction she isn't shy about sharing. She sends birthday cards 3 days early because arriving exactly on the day is, in her view, a mild form of lateness. She had always been proud of my sister Ellen, a physical therapist for 18 years in the same practice. Proud of my brother David, who manages a hardware distribution chain and earns enough that the number doesn't come up in polite conversation. About me, she had always been uncertain. The way someone is uncertain about a piece of furniture that doesn't fit the current room, but might fit one they can't quite picture. When I left my corporate job 20 years ago to buy my first building, she asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked if I'd thought it through. I said yes. She asked if I could get the corporate job back if it didn't work out. I said probably not, since I'd resigned. She went quiet the way she goes quiet when she's decided that more objections won't help, and the kindest thing is to be supportive in a tone that still contains her reservations. She was never unkind about it. She just never fully understood it. When people at church or book club asked what I did, she gave the answer that required the least follow-up. She works in real estate, but works in real estate covers an enormous range. From someone who shows houses on weekends to someone who owns a portfolio of properties across 3 zip codes. And my mother consistently delivered that phrase in a tone that suggested the former. When pressed, she'd say I worked independently. When pressed further, she sometimes said I was figuring some things out, which wasn't accurate from about 2008 onward, but was the answer she'd learned to give in 2004, when things were genuinely uncertain, and which she apparently hadn't updated. The first time I noticed the pattern clearly was at her book club in December of 2007. I wasn't there. She told me about it afterward, casually, without understanding what she was telling me. There was a new woman in the group named Vera, a recently retired school teacher from Wilkes-Barre, who had asked about Lorraine's children. My mother described Ellen, the practice, the patience, the established career, with the specific pleasure of a mother describing legible work. She described David the same way. Then she got to me. Christine works in real estate, on her own. Vera had said that real estate sounded like a good business these days. My mother had agreed and moved on. She told me this on the following Sunday phone call. Without realizing what she'd done, she'd given Vera a summary that was accurate in the word, but wrong in the scale, and she hadn't realized because she'd never confronted the difference between the two. On her own, covered a range that went from someone who showed houses on weekends to someone who owned a portfolio of properties across multiple zip codes, and my mother consistently delivered it in a tone that suggested the first, because the first was what she'd anticipated when I left my corporate job 3 years earlier, and the update had never arrived. I said nothing at the time. It was December, she was happy about the book club, and Vera was someone I'd never meet. The imprecision hadn't hurt anyone yet. The problem with imprecisions that haven't hurt anyone is that you don't correct them, and when you don't correct them, they persist, and when they persist, they solidify into narrative. By 2009, she'd found the phrase that required the least follow-up. She works on her own. Real estate, you know how it is. The second part, you know how it is, was the mechanism. It closed off follow-up questions before they arrived. It implied nothing more needed saying because the listener already understood, even if the listener understood nothing of the kind. By 2011, when I had 3 buildings and was in the middle of renovating the third, she'd added, she's very dedicated to the package. Works on her own, real estate, very dedicated. The dedicated was genuine. She knew I worked hard because sometimes I'd call from the office after 6 and she'd worry about the hours. But dedicated in the context of on her own real estate painted a specific picture. Someone hardworking and committed to something still trying to establish itself, not someone who'd established it and was managing it. At Christmas of 2011, Ellen and I were washing dishes in my mother's kitchen when Ellen said, without preamble, "She has no idea of the scale of what you do. Have you ever tried to explain?" I tried, in the beginning, and she listened, but the information doesn't seem to have stuck. Ellen considered this while washing a serving dish. She's proud of you, in an abstract and vaguely anxious way, but genuinely. I know. But she'd need a different vocabulary to describe what you do, and she doesn't have that vocabulary. There was nothing wrong with Ellen's observation. It was accurate. I'd avoided the direct conversation for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time. It wasn't the right moment. There would be no natural opening. Explaining from scratch at a family dinner would be awkward for everyone. The most honest version was simpler. I hadn't wanted to have to explain. I'd wanted to be seen without having to build the picture piece by piece. My mother came in just then to get more pie, and we changed subjects. The real estate conversation didn't come up. The years continued in that pattern. By the time she'd moved from very dedicated to she's figuring it out, you know how it is, which wasn't accurate from about 2008 onward, I'd stopped tracking exactly when the language shifted. It didn't shift all at once. It shifted the way language shifts when no one corrects it, gradually, in the direction of whatever phrase closes off the most questions. I found out from Linda. August, 2 years before the party, lunch at a Thai place on Market Street that we'd been postponing for 6 months and finally managed. Linda said she'd run into our cousin Mary Beth at the mall, and Mary Beth had asked about me with that specific quality of concern that disguises itself as interest, but is really a confirmation of something the person already believes and would like confirmed out loud. Mary Beth had said, "Is Christine okay? Your aunt mentioned she's been having a hard time finding something." Linda told her she wasn't aware of any hard time. Mary Beth seemed uncertain and said she was just passing on what Aunt Lorraine had said at Easter, that Christine was in between things and the family was hoping something would come through soon. Linda told me this over green curry and watched my face while she did. I said what I thought, which was that it wasn't surprising. And then I ate my curry and we talked about her daughter's soccer season, and the rest of the lunch was fine. But I carried it home with me. Over the following weeks, I became aware of the texture of it, the small recalibrations other relatives made when they spoke with me, the specific quality of Aunt Patrice's questions at David's birthday in September. "Are you keeping busy?" The way Uncle Gerald, who is normally quite direct and has never asked a question he wasn't prepared to receive an answer to, had suddenly become careful when I mentioned what I'd been working on, nodding in that slow, slightly sideways way of people who've been told something and are trying not to show that they have. There was a version of me circulating through my family that was not the version I was living. The circulating version was, "Christine isn't doing particularly well, professionally. We'll ask general questions. We'll be kind." They were being kind. I understood why, and in the abstract I appreciated it. The way you appreciate a gesture whose origin is love, even when the execution creates a problem. In practice, it was like wearing a costume without knowing it, and being put in a room full of people who'd seen the costume and decided, out of kindness, not to mention it. In September, I went to David's birthday and saw the pattern in person for the first time, not just through secondhand accounts. There were 40-some relatives and co-workers in David's backyard in Carbondale on a Saturday afternoon that started sunny and ended with a breeze that sent everyone inside around 8. Gerald had arrived early, as always, and was standing with my brother at the grill, discussing the charcoal versus gas question with the opposing positions and firm certainty of decades. When I walked over to say hello, he embraced me the way he always does. Both hands, the specific gesture he developed maybe 30 years ago and never abandons. Then he talked about the drive over, whether traffic had been reasonable, whether I'd tried the new sandwich place on Market he'd mentioned last time. Gerald is a man who warms up before he says what he means to say. It's a quality, most of the time. That afternoon, I could see the calibration happening underneath the conversation, the preparation for the question that was coming. "How's work?" he said eventually. I told him work was good, busy. He nodded with relief that was genuine. That was what made it disturbing. Not the care or the gentleness, both of which were real, but the relief. Genuine relief implies genuine prior concern, and genuine concern about work implies specific information received. Someone had said something to Gerald that produced specific worry in him, and his relief at learning I was fine was proportional to that worry. We talked about something else, the roof of his golf club, which had needed work for 2 years and had finally reached the point where it couldn't be put off. His nephew, starting college in the spring. Concrete, easy conversation, the family talk that's more about presence than content. Gerald is good at those conversations. I was in two at once, the one with him and the one I was having in my head about what I'd heard and what it implied. Aunt Patrice asked me directly at some point in the afternoon whether I was keeping busy, with the specific delivery of someone who's been told something and is being kind within the parameters of that information. The cushioned quality of a question whose recipient had been pre-warned she might be having difficulties and who was being checked on in a way that required neither party to address it directly. I said I was very busy, thank you. She said that was wonderful, just wonderful, and changed subjects. I drove home at 10 o'clock and tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly anger. There was no malice in what had happened at David's birthday, only attention applied to the wrong map. The people who loved my mother trusted her version of me more than evidence they'd never received because her version was the one they had. What stayed with me, sitting in the car in that October dark, was Gerald's relief. He'd been genuinely relieved to learn I was fine, which meant he'd been genuinely worried. Working from the information his sister had given him, someone he trusted, he had built real concern about my situation, and I was the only person in that backyard who knew how unfounded it was. That thought stayed with me through the rest of the fall. I didn't do anything with it. I just held it. My name is Christine Hartley. I'm 58 years old. My company is Hartley Properties, LLC, which I founded in 2004 with a single 6-unit building on Pine Street in Scranton, and which now owns 4 buildings across 2 counties with 93 combined units. This didn't happen quickly. The first building was on Pine Street, purchased with a loan that took 3 years to qualify for and nearly didn't happen, which required me to act as my own maintenance contact for the first 18 months because I couldn't afford to hire anyone, which means I spent a good part of 2004 and 2005 learning things about plumbing I had no particular desire to know, but which have since proved useful. The building had a tenant named Mr. Kowalski on the 2nd floor who had been there 11 years before I bought it and had developed, in that time, very specific opinions about acceptable noise levels, acceptable hallway paint colors, and the correct positioning of mailboxes in the lobby, all of which he communicated to me in writing. I kept his letters because they had a literary quality I genuinely admired, even when the content was inconvenient. Mr. Kowalski lived in that building until 2017, when he passed away. His daughter called to tell me. She said her father had mentioned me once that the building was better managed than it had been before, and she understood that to be a significant compliment coming from Mr. Kowalski. I sent flowers to the funeral, not white daisies, yellow. The second building came in 2007 through a broker named Tom Heaney, who called me about a 12-unit in Dunmore that had been on the market for 8 months, because the owner had deferred maintenance for a decade, and the asking price didn't account for the work the building needed. Tom and I walked it on a Tuesday morning, and I spent the whole visit doing arithmetic in my head. And when we got back to the sidewalk, I'd made a preliminary decision. I told Tom I needed 3 days. He said to take 4. I took 4, got the inspection, revised the arithmetic, made an offer, and got the building. That building is what I now call North Dunmore. It took 14 months and a sum of money that exceeded my original estimate by enough that I had several long nights in 2008 sitting at the kitchen table redoing the math. Because redoing the math was the only constructive thing I could do with the anxiety. The building stabilized. The units filled. The third building came in 2011, 10 units south of Wilkes-Barre, purchased from an estate. The fourth came in 2015. That's the one I call South Dunmore. Purchased in the spring, renovated that fall and winter, all units occupied by February 2016. Uncle Gerald moved into a unit at South Dunmore in October of 2018. His lease is in a file in my office, with his signature and Renee's initials on the second page. Renee has been my office manager since 2013. She is better at the administrative operation of this company than I am, which I recognized within the first 6 months and haven't revised since, because when you recognize something clearly, you don't need to revisit it. I told Renee, when Gerald's application came in, that his lease would be processed the same as any other, which it was, and that his tenancy would be handled the same as any other, which it was. At no point in the 4 years that followed did I mention to Gerald that I owned the building. A lease is a private financial document. It wasn't my information to offer at Christmas. Anita and Terry moved into North Dunmore in 2020. Same conversation with Renee. Same process. I had thought at various points over the years about how to have the conversation with my mother about what I'd built. You can't simply announce it. There's no natural opening in which you say, by the way, I own 93 rental units across 2 counties, 2 of which house your brother and your niece. You wait for a question that comes close enough to answer honestly, and the question never comes at the right angle, and the years pass, and the buildings accumulate, and the question still doesn't come. The party came first. On Thursday before the party, Renee placed the file for the 5th property on my desk, a building in North Scranton, 16 units, owner wanting out after 22 years, solid structure, but needing cosmetic updates in the apartments. I'd been watching it for 6 months. It was a good buy if the numbers held, and there were reasons to believe they would. I spent that afternoon working through the numbers while Renee answered emails in her office on the other side of the glass wall. At 5:30, she knocked on my door. I'm heading out. Are you all right? I'm fine. Your mother's birthday is Saturday, you said. It is. Remember to leave before the parking lot locks. They close the gate at 6 now. I left at 5:52. The afternoon was cold in the specific way October in Scranton is cold. That chill that isn't winter yet, but isn't negotiable either. I sat in the car for a moment before starting it. The 5th property file was on my desk. Saturday was 2 days away. On Wednesday, my mother had called to confirm, a practical call. She wanted to know whether I'd bring something to eat or would prefer a gift card from a store. I said I'd bring flowers. She said that was lovely, that everyone was looking forward to seeing me, and then added, after a small pause, "How is everything? Is work going well?" The 5th property file was open on my desk. Gerald's lease was in a file 2 feet from me. I said, "You don't need to worry." "That's good to hear," she said. "See you Saturday then." On Friday at 5 o'clock, Renee left, said goodnight, closed the office door. I stayed another hour with the documents. There was a thought that had been circulating intermittently for the past few weeks. It would be possible to send a text saying something had come up with work. My mother would understand. When it comes to work, she always understands, even when she doesn't understand the work. I could send flowers anyway. I could call on Monday. I sat with the thought. It wasn't new. I'd had versions of it before every family event in the past 2 years, since Linda had told me. There was a specific discomfort in showing up, knowing I was the version that circulated, knowing I was not that version. A discomfort I developed reasonable tolerance for, but which hadn't gone away. The question that kept coming back was different. Why go if the version isn't going to change? And the honest answer was that there was a small part of me that thought it might. Not through confrontation or announcement. I'd never done that, and there was no reason to start at a 70th birthday party. But that something might happen. A question at the right angle, a conversation that came close enough to the real information. Something. Or nothing might change, and I'd go anyway, because it was my mother's 70th birthday, and you drive 40 minutes for that, even in the costume, even with the parallel accounting, you know you'll be doing all afternoon. I turned off the light. I left. I locked the door. Saturday morning, I bought the daisies. White, which were the right kind, at the flower shop on Main Street I've used since it opened there in 2009. The woman behind the counter knows my preferences and doesn't try to sell me what she has in stock that day. She tells me what came in and lets me decide. The daisies were good that week. I took a bunch large enough to fill a reasonable vase. I drove with the daisies on the passenger seat and a paper coffee cup that had gone cold by half. The highway was clear, that October morning quality of light that still has brightness but already has weight. I didn't plan what I'd say. The times I've planned family conversations in advance, they've never gone as planned, and I've had to improvise from a position of having already abandoned the script. Better to go in without one. Better to answer what comes. Patrice's street was full when I arrived. 6-7 cars along the curb, Helen's minivan in the driveway. The maple in the front yard had gone orange since my last visit. Someone had put a handmade banner over the front door, Happy 70th Lorraine, in balloon letters that were slightly compressed on the right side, where the person making it had run out of space. My mother would notice the spacing. She wouldn't say anything about it. She'd say it was beautiful. The living room was full when I arrived. There's a particular geometry to my family, in enclosed spaces, that I've spent my life navigating. Patrice's living room isn't large, maybe 14 by 20 feet, with a couch along one wall, 2 armchairs facing it, and a long folding table set up along the window that hadn't been there on my last visit, and was now covered with a paper tablecloth and holding an arrangement of dishes representing the combined output of 6 families who had each been told to bring something. The effect was the specific chaos of a collaborative dinner. Casseroles of uncertain provenance, a potato salad in a bowl I recognized as Ruth Ann's specific serving bowl, a foil-covered baking dish that could have been anything. My mother was at the far end of the room, standing with her sister Helen and a woman I didn't immediately recognize, who turned out to be Donna, Helen's neighbor, whom I'd met perhaps 3 times over the years, and who has a relationship with the phrase "actually" that makes every conversation feel like a series of gentle corrections arriving from different directions. My mother looked up when I came in. She smiled, the specific relief of someone who had been quietly worrying about something and could now set that weight down. Christine. She crossed the room and hugged me. She smells of the same soap she's used my entire life. Ivory. Simple. Nothing added. Nothing decorative. I was starting to wonder. The traffic was fine. I'm 2 minutes early. I know. She was already looking at the flowers. Daisies. White. I remembered. She took them and held them in a way that said she was happy with them and would find a vase and deal with Patrice later. Come say hello. Everyone's here. Linda found me near the folding table, and we hugged, and she looked at me with an expression that contained a small private acknowledgement. She knew I knew, and she knew I knew she hadn't told anyone else. And I gave her the minimum nod, and she gave one back, and we moved on without saying anything, which is how we've communicated about difficult things since we were 12. Uncle Gerald was in the armchair near the window. He stood when I walked over. He always does, since I was 22 and he decided I was old enough for that specific form of greeting, and shook my hand with both of his, the way he always shakes it. "Christine, good to see you. You too." He asked how work was going. He asked carefully, with the gentle calibration I'd been tracking for 2 years, the careful quality of someone who'd been given a version of a story and was trying to be kind within the constraints of that version. "Going well," I said. He nodded with what seemed like genuine relief. "Good. Good." We talked about his fence. He'd put in a new one in the spring. Pressure-treated wood. He'd done most of the work himself. Asked a nephew to help with the gate because the angle was difficult. He'd had trouble with one section where the soil wasn't level and the post hole borer kept going sideways. He described this problem the way he describes problems with systems, carefully, with specific measurements, walking through it in order. He asked if I dealt with anything similar. I had, in the context of a fence at the perimeter of my Scranton building. We talked through it for a moment. He was interested in the problem-solving process, not in why I'd been dealing with a fence on a rental property. That question didn't arise. I watched Aunt Patrice while I talked with Gerald. She was on the other side of the room, managing the food situation with her usual focused competence, but also doing what she does at family gatherings, which is cataloging arrivals and running assessments. She's done this since before I can remember. She keeps a mental accounting of who in the family is doing well and who isn't, updates it at each gathering, and the entries change slowly, but they change. And the entry for Christine had long read some version of uncertain, and she was clearly filing my arrival under the same heading. She smiled at me when our eyes met, warm and specific, the smile of someone comfortable in her position relative to you. At 3, the food was put out. My sister Ellen had arrived at 2:30 with her husband Rob and their youngest, age 9, who had recently discovered that asking direct questions is the most efficient tool for understanding the world, with little apparent awareness that this isn't universally appreciated. He asked Gerald why his nose had that shape. He asked me what investing meant, which I explained simply and which he accepted with the neutrality of someone filing information for later. He asked Patrice why the banner letters were uneven on the right side. Patrice said it had been made by hand and represented a great deal of effort. The boy considered this and went to find the chips. My mother moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this afternoon since July. She tracked who had tried which dish and who needed a refill, and which conversations were heading toward topics she'd pre-identified as risky. I watched her work. It's a genuine skill, managing a room with 7 siblings and their children and their opinions and accumulated histories requires abilities that don't appear on any document but are undeniably real. At some point she was near me, refilling a water pitcher, and my cousin Anita, who lives in my building 6 blocks away without knowing it, asked what Christine had been up to these days. My mother said, "She's keeping busy," in a tone that landed between "she's fine" and "let's not get into it." Anita accepted that and turned back to a conversation about her kids. My mother refilled the pitcher. I got a second portion of Ruth Ann's potato salad. I said nothing. I was watching. The afternoon had a specific temperature, too warm for the number of people in a space comfortable for 10, with the air quality that colonial houses develop when the windows are kept closed well into October out of caution against cold that hasn't arrived yet. I knew that warmth from memory. It was the warmth of every Christmas, every Easter, every birthday party in that house for the past 40-some years. Donna found me near the food table at 3:10. She remembered me from a previous gathering and asked what I was doing these days. I gave her the direct answer: property management, 4 buildings, 2 counties. It had been a solid season. Donna said her niece had been thinking about investing in real estate and asked if I'd take a call. I said yes, that my office manager could schedule it, and gave her the office number. Donna said she'd love that in this market, it was wonderful to know someone with real experience. My mother was 2 feet away, refilling a bowl. I couldn't see her directly, but I could register from her posture that she'd caught the tone of the conversation, not the content, but the tone of someone receiving Christine's business number rather than expressions of sympathy about Christine. She didn't approach. She focused on the bowl. When Donna and I parted, my mother went to speak with Helen about something I didn't catch. There was a small, not entirely honorable quality to what I noticed next. A minor satisfaction at watching the discrepancy become visible at the edge of my mother's field of vision. I won't rewrite that. It was there. Ellen was near the window with Rob. She saw me and nodded with the specific acknowledgement of someone who knows more than she's showing. Ellen knew what my mother had been saying, not because I told her, but because she's my sister and had lived in the same family constellation for 50 years and paid attention. She hadn't corrected my mother. I'd understood why over the years. Ellen considers public corrections counterproductive on principle, and in the abstract, she isn't wrong. Public corrections make Lorraine defensive and end conversations without resolving anything. So she hadn't corrected, and neither had I. And the years had passed exactly as years pass, when neither party involved takes the initiative to say what they know. There was a nod between us that contained all of that understanding without needing words. That was enough. At 3:40, I was near the folding table with a cup of coffee, watching Patrice complete another circuit of the room. She had her usual efficiency. A conversation with Anita, a moment with Helen, 2 minutes standing near my mother at the window that had the texture of a debriefing. My mother was listening with the posture she uses when she's receiving unanticipated information, leaning slightly forward, asking short questions. I couldn't hear, but I could read the exchange. Patrice had told my mother what she'd learned, or tried to learn, in the earlier conversation about Christine's professional situation. My mother looked at me once from the window, not for long, just a locating glance, and then turned back to Patrice. There was something in that look I couldn't fully read, something that hadn't been there before. I got a second cup of coffee. Aunt Patrice found me at 4 o'clock. I'd been half expecting this. She moves through family gatherings with the focused intent of someone completing a list, and I'd watched her circulating for the better part of an hour. A conversation with Anita, a conversation with Helen, a few minutes more my mother at the window that had the texture of a briefing. When she came to sit beside me near the end of the food table, she had the pleasant, composed expression of someone opening a conversation from a position of comfortable certainty. "So, Christine," she said, "catch me up. What are you working on these days?" The question was simple. The question was also not simple. There's a specific intonation in "what are you working on these days" when the person asking has been told you're not working on much. A gentleness at the end, a careful quality, as if the question had been cushioned for impact. She was being kind. She'd been given a story. She was asking within the parameters of that story. There was a smaller thought I barely acknowledged. I wanted to see the expression on her face change. I wanted that. I won't pretend I didn't. "Property management mostly," I said. "We've had a busy few quarters." She tilted her head slightly. "Is it going well?" "Very well." A pause. "Your mother mentioned you were looking for something a bit more stable. I wasn't sure if you were still—" "I think there may have been some miscommunication," I said. "I've been running my own company for 20 years. It's quite stable." She absorbed this. Her expression adjusted. A visible recalibration, a small shift in how she was holding the conversation. She said, "Well, that's wonderful," in a tone that suggested she'd placed the information in a holding category and would return to it. She went to get her punch. My mother was about a yard away and had heard at least part of it, and started a conversation with Helen about whether Helen had tried the ZD, louder than strictly necessary. And I understood that this was not something she was ready to engage with in a room full of relatives, and I let it go. Patrice wasn't finished. She came back 20 minutes later with Mary Beth, my cousin, who had told Linda I was having a hard time finding something. And the two of them had the quality of people who'd shared information and arrived at a joint position. Patrice mentioned there was an opening at her son-in-law's company, a small firm but very stable, the kind of thing with real growth. Mary Beth said she could put me in touch if I wanted. I said I appreciated it, but I was fine. Patrice said there was certainly no pressure. She just wanted me to know there were options. I said there were options. She smiled, with the quality of a person who'd done what she was supposed to do and could move forward with a clear conscience. I went to get more coffee. The room had shifted slightly after my exchange with Patrice, not dramatically, but in a way I could register. A different circulation, a quality of people processing new information while continuing to do what they were doing. Mary Beth on the sofa with her phone, but with the posture of someone thinking rather than reading. Linda near the table, quieter than before. I watched my mother from across the room. She'd been near the window during the minutes of Patrice's conversation with me, not close enough to hear clearly, but close enough to see that a conversation had happened and lasted longer than a casual exchange. Now she was with Helen, but there was a levity that had gone out, replaced by something more measured. She knew Patrice had approached. She knew I'd responded. She didn't yet know what I'd said. At 4:20, Ruth Ann, Patrice's granddaughter, 17, entirely focused on the logistics of the birthday cake, came out of the kitchen and began reorganizing the food table to make room for dessert. She did this with the efficiency of someone completing a task, completely impervious to the undercurrents around her. She arranged plates, confirmed the candles were where they needed to be, went for the dessert plates. Gerald was back in the armchair near the window. Terry had just sat down beside him, and they were resuming a conversation that had started somewhere in the afternoon. I positioned myself near the folding table with my coffee. It was Gerald who finished it. He was back in the armchair near the window when I returned to circulating, and he was talking to Terry, Anita's husband, my tenant, a man who discovers informality in careful increments, about a letter he'd received from the property management company at his building about a parking policy update, a clarification about guest parking in the lot. Nothing complicated, just a regulation about how long a guest's car could stay without registering at the office. He said he'd found it reasonable. He appreciated when property management communicated things clearly rather than letting them become ambiguous. They're pretty responsive there, he said. What's the name? Hartley Properties. I've had a couple of things over the years, and they've always dealt with them quickly. Good company. I was maybe 5 feet away, near the folding table, with my coffee cup. Mary Beth, who was on the sofa and had heard at least 2 different versions of the story about Christine's employment situation, looked up from her phone. Linda, across the room, looked up. Terry said, slowly, Hartley Properties. I think my wife's lease came through them. That's the one, Gerald said. I looked at him. Hartley Properties. Which building do you live in? South Dunmore, on Crestwood. Why? I set my coffee cup on the edge of the folding table. I opened my bag. I carry cards for everything. I've done this since 2005, when I showed up at a meeting without one and decided to never do that again. I took out a card and walked over and handed it to him. He took it. He looked at it. The card is simple, white with black text, my name, the company name, a phone number, an address. Christine Hartley, Hartley Properties, LLC. Gerald looked at the card. He looked at me. He looked at the card again. He is a man who spent his professional life in telecommunications, which is a field built on understanding how systems connect and what the name on the other side of a transaction means. He understood immediately. I watched him understand. The building where he lived, the name on the paperwork from his lease, the name on the card in his hand, the woman in front of him, and I watched him arrive at the conclusion with the quiet precision of someone who doesn't need to dramatize recognition. "You own it," he said. 4 buildings. Yours is one of them. He sat with that for a moment. Anita's too, on the north side? Yes. He looked across the room at Anita, who had heard her name and was moving toward us, and whose expression was doing something similar to Gerald's, the slow arrival of a rearrangement. "Since when?" he asked. "You've been in South Dunmore 4 years. Anita and Terry have been in North Dunmore 3. And you never. Your lease is a private document. Your rental history is your private information. It wasn't mine to bring up at Christmas." A pause. Mary Beth on the sofa was no longer pretending. She'd put the phone down. Patrice had come back from wherever she'd gone and was standing near the folding table with her punch glass and an expression I had never seen on her face before, a very specific suspension of her usual processing, as if the spreadsheet she maintained had encountered a row it couldn't categorize. Terry said slowly, "So Christine is the company." "The company is mine," I said. "Yes." He absorbed this with the thoroughness of someone in insurance evaluating a situation. "Renee is your office manager." "She is." "She's very good," he said. "She handled the door handle issue in 48 hours. "She is very good," I agreed. Gerald turned the card over and then turned it face up again. He placed it on his knee with a deliberate quality, the way you set something down when you want to make clear you're keeping it. "Your mother mentioned you worked in real estate," he said. He stopped, reconsidered, made it sound smaller than this. "I know. She doesn't know? She's about to." He nodded with the quiet finality of a man who has just updated something fundamental and found the updated version preferable. He raised the card briefly, a small gesture, almost a toast without a glass, and then returned to the conversation with Terry, and the thread of it resumed, and the room began to talk again in the recalibrated way rooms talk after information has shifted the texture of the air. Anita was the first to approach directly. Not immediately, there was a moment of absorption, but in less than 2 minutes she was beside me, with the expression of someone still processing, but who decided the best way to process was to have the conversation. "You own the building," she said. Not a question. 3 years. "I never." She stopped, started again. "You never mentioned it. Your lease is private information. It wasn't mine to bring up." She held that for a moment. Terry was beside her, with the quality of someone evaluating a situation from multiple directions at once. "Renee," he said eventually, "the office manager. Does she know that you and Anita are related?" "She knows Gerald is a relative. She didn't know Anita was my cousin. Same process regardless." So the door handle came through the maintenance line. Renee coordinated. Team handled it. 48 hours, he said. "Usually less," I said. "Door handles are straightforward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good company." And there was in the statement the quality of a genuine assessment, not courtesy. Terry is the type of person who says what he thinks about service quality and has no reason to be polite about it with his wife's cousin. I said I was glad to hear it. Anita had been listening to the exchange. 3 years, she said again, working through the arithmetic. Gerald 4. October 2018, Gerald. January 2021, you two. She looked across at Gerald, who had noticed and raised the card briefly from his knee, the same near toast gesture. Anita looked at the card and then at me. Why never say anything, she said. All those Christmases, all those Thanksgivings, not once. Same reason I don't mention it to any tenant I meet socially. The transaction is commercial. The family relationship is separate. Keeping them separate is cleaner for everyone. She considered this. But you knew. All those family dinners, you knew. You're a strange person, Christine, she said, but there was affection in the tone, the kind that covers assessments you admire even when they unsettle you. I'm consistent, I said. She went to find Terry, and the two of them exchanged something quietly that I didn't hear, but that from Terry's body language involved numbers. Mary Beth had gotten up from the sofa. She was standing near the edge of the room, with an expression that had changed since 4 o'clock, since the conversation about the job opening at her husband's firm. The file she'd been keeping was being updated in real time. She looked at me for a moment and then went for more to drink. Linda was a few feet from me, near the folding table, and had been quiet through most of this. She processes internally before speaking, and the amount of processing that afternoon had required was considerable. She looked at me now with the expression she has when she's telling me something without words. It was the August expression from the Thai restaurant, but inverted. Not the expression of someone delivering difficult news, but of someone watching a situation resolve in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. I gave her the minimum nod. She returned it. The room had changed temperature. Not the air temperature, the social temperature, that specific quality of how people position themselves relative to each other after information has shifted the distribution of power in a conversation. Quieter now, more deliberate. Ellen's boy was in the kitchen with Ruth Ann. The adults were in smaller, more specific conversations. The cake was still at 5. In the meantime, the room reorganized itself. My mother found me at the kitchen door at 4:30. She'd been looking for me since Gerald. I watched her working the room. A quick conversation with Patrice, a conversation with Helen, a moment near the window, alone, that had the texture of the moment just before a decision. She found me at the kitchen door, and we went in because the kitchen was quieter, and neither of us wanted a room full of relatives for this. The kitchen smelled of the casseroles and the coffee and the particular underlying smell of Patrice's house, which has always been there. The daisies were on the counter in a tall glass vase. She'd found one in Patrice's cabinet, and the flowers were there, and I noticed that. Christine, Mom. She looked at me for a long moment. She's looked at me in many specific ways over the course of my life, and I've learned to read most of them. This one I hadn't seen before. It was the look of someone who just had to revise a story they'd been telling, and was now on the other side of the revision, unsure of exactly where they were standing. Geraldine told me, she said. She always calls Gerald Geraldine when she's unsettled. He stopped reacting to it 40 years ago. It's all right, I said. You own his building. I do. A pause. The refrigerator made a sound. And Anita's? Yes. And there are others. 4 buildings, 93 units total. She absorbed this with the focused silence she uses for large numbers. You never told me. I was waiting for the right moment to have a different conversation. I didn't anticipate the party being the place. She looked at the daisies. She straightened a stem that didn't need straightening. I've been telling people. She stopped. I know what you've been telling people, I said. Linda told me 2 years ago. The color of her expression changed. I didn't mean to make it sound like you were. I just didn't know how to explain. I know. When you left the corporate job, I thought, I know what you thought. I understood it at the time. You were worried. I was worried. You were allowed to be worried. But when things kept going, when the business kept working, the story didn't update. That part bothered me. You should have told me to stop. Yes, I said. You're right, I should have. She took a breath. I'm sorry, Christine. I know you are. A pause. The specific October light came through Patrice's kitchen window at an angle that made everything in the room slightly more significant than it was. Your father would have understood better, she said. He was good with that kind of thing, systems. He liked knowing how things fit together. You're very like him in that. I've been told this before at various points over the years. It lands differently at different moments in my life. That afternoon, in Patrice's kitchen, with the daisies on the counter and the coffee in the maker, it landed where it was supposed to. 4 buildings, she said again, not as a question, as a number she was placing somewhere real. Working on the 5th in the spring. She looked at me and then looked at the window. I should have paid more attention. Yes, I said. You should have. I will now. Good, I said. She put her hand on my arm for a moment, the brief, specific gesture she uses when she's communicated something she couldn't say directly, which is her form of articulation for what other people might call, I love you and I was wrong and I'll do better, all at once. Then she withdrew her hand and straightened the daisy again and said, the cake is at 5. Will you stay? I drove 40 minutes, I said. Yes, I'll stay. The rest of the afternoon went differently from the first part. Mary Beth found me near the food table at 4:40 and asked me approximately 4 questions about property management, which I answered at various levels of detail. She asked about vacancy rates. She asked about handling difficult tenants. She asked about market conditions in the Scranton area. She asked about my tax structure, which I declined to discuss at a birthday party. She absorbed all of it with the diligence of someone updating a file. I could see the update happening in real time. The entry for Christine changing from uncertain to something more precise. Patrice remained noticeably quieter for the rest of the afternoon. Not cold. Patrice considers coldness too sophisticated for her range, meaning not sophisticated enough, but recalibrated. The confident ease she'd had at 4 o'clock when she'd asked what I was working on with that particular gentle intonation had been replaced by something more careful. Anita came to sit next to me near the end of the afternoon. She said she'd had no idea. I told her I hadn't said anything because it was her home and her private information. She said the maintenance had always been good. I said I was glad to hear it. Terry shook my hand once, quickly, without ceremony, and went with her. Gerald found me when people were starting to leave. He said, you know, when I had that trouble with the fence post in the spring, I almost called the building office. I figured Hartley Properties would know someone. A pause. Probably wouldn't have been the right call. Probably not, I said, but the offer stands. He laughed, a genuine brief sound, the kind he makes when something actually gets him rather than when he's being polite. He shook my hand with both of his. Give her a good Christmas present, he said, nodding in the direction of where my mother was saying goodbye to Helen. I always do, I said. He put on his coat and went out into the October evening. My mother walked me to my car. It was past 5:30 and the light was going, that specific dense October blue that arrives before dark. She had her sweater on and was carrying the vase with the daisies because she decided she was taking them home and had informed Patrice of this in a tone that didn't invite debate. I carry my car keys when I leave a family gathering so I don't have to stop and look for them in the car, a habit I developed when I was 26 and ran into an ex-boyfriend in a parking lot at Christmas and had to pretend to be looking for keys I'd already found in order to end the conversation. Old habits. At the car, she said, I'm sorry again for what I was telling people. I know. I genuinely thought I was helping. I thought it was kinder then. I didn't know the right way to describe it. So I simplified. I know that. The summary was wrong. It was, I said. I unlocked the car. Drive carefully getting home. I will. She waited on the sidewalk while I got in, the daisies in the crook of one arm, and she was still there when I turned onto the street. I watched her in the rearview mirror until I turned the corner. The October light had almost gone. I drove home with the radio off for most of it, turned it on to the last 10 minutes, and didn't register what was playing, and turned it off again. I made tea when I got home, and stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated, and thought about nothing specific. The flower shop parking lot, Gerald's expression when he read the card, the look on Patrice's face that I hadn't been able to fully read, and probably wouldn't. She called me the following Thursday, 4 days after the party, Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. She called because she'd run into Peggy, a book club friend who had at some point received the Between Things version, and my mother had corrected it. She told Peggy that Christine managed a property company, 4 buildings across 2 counties, 93 units, had been doing it for 20 years. She said it simply, the way you say a thing when you finally have the right information to say it. Peggy had found that impressive. Peggy was right, I said. A pause. I should have asked better questions over the years. Yes. I didn't know how. I didn't understand the work. I know. I'd like to understand it now, if you're willing to explain. So I explained. Not everything in one call. There are years and decisions and moments that go into 4 buildings, and you don't get all of it on a Thursday afternoon, but the shape of it. The first building, Mr. Kowalski. Tom Heaney, the broker, and the North Dunmore building, and the 14 months of renovation. The Wilkes-Barre building from the estate. South Dunmore in 2015. Renee and the office, and how the maintenance system works. My mother listened. She asked 2 questions that were genuinely good ones, about what happens when a unit sits vacant for a long time, and about how I handled situations when a tenant couldn't pay. I answered directly, without simplifying. She listened to the answers with the focused attention she gives to things she's decided to take seriously. When I finished, she said, "You built this, from one building. From one building." She was quiet with that, the specific silence of someone recalibrating something fundamental. "Same time next week," she said finally. The following week, she was the one who called. The Monday after the party, Renee placed the 5th property file on my desk. It was early, just past 7, before any meeting had arrived. The office was quiet, the way it's quiet at that hour, just the sound of the central heat and the occasional car outside. I sat at my desk and opened the file and started working. The window was out there. The street was quiet. It was just a Monday.